Welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us, well, quite a stack of sources today, and they really get into something fundamental, don't they? The sociology of gender.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that touches every part of life where the personal meets the political, biology meets culture. It's complex.
Definitely complex. And our mission today, based on this material, is to try and break down this huge social framework. The sources kick things off with some really basic but honestly profound questions.
Yeah, like what actually determines gender? Is it just about reproductive organs? Or is it your clothes, your hair, how you act?
Right. Or is it something you do, like a performance, or something you fundamentally are? And I love this one. How do you know if you're any good at your gender? That's such a sociological way to put it.
It really is. And these questions immediately push back against that simple, fixed idea of a strict gender binary. Just two options.
Because most people are assigned a gender at birth based on, well, what's visible, and they feel comfortable with that. But the sources make it clear that this two-option model, it just doesn't cover the full reality of human experience.
The numbers are pretty striking, actually. That Herman study from 2022, it found 1.6 million people just in the U.S. identify with a gender different from the one assigned at birth.
Wow, 1.6 million. That's not a small number. You can't just treat that as some kind of rare exception.
Exactly. It forces us to really look at gender not just as a biological footnote, but as this core piece of social identity.
So our job today is to use that sociological imagination, like you said, and explore gender as something that's socially constructed, meaning it's imposed on us, but also enforced, reproduced, even negotiated and challenged all the time.
And maybe the single biggest idea, the core thesis from all of this material we need to get across right away is this. The dominant gender binary, the idea of just man or woman, it's real but not true.
Okay, hold on. Real but not true. That sounds like a riddle. What exactly does that mean when we're talking about gender?
Well, think about money. That piece of paper in your wallet, right? It doesn't have any actual intrinsic value. It's just paper, ink, maybe some fancy threads.
Right. Worthless on its own.
But because our society, our laws, our banks, everyone agrees it does have value, it becomes incredibly real. It literally dictates your life, what you can buy, where you can live, your status.
Ah, okay. But if we all suddenly decided tomorrow that, I don't know, seashells were currency instead, that paper would be meaningless again.
Precisely. So its value isn't objectively, universally true. It's a shared agreement. Gender works the same way. It's real because our society structures laws, opportunities, expectations, even access to bathrooms around it. It has massive concrete consequences.
But it's not true because it's not fixed across all cultures or all of history or even, as we'll see, across all biological possibilities. It's a powerful social agreement.
Exactly. A fiction with very real effects.
Yep.
So we're going to unpack how this construct operates. We'll look at it in three main parts. First, gender as this huge social framework. We'll use the Lorber model for that.
Okay.
Second, we'll dig into the biology, the variations that actually challenge the idea of a strict sex binary.
Right, the biological basis or lack thereof.
And finally, we'll look at how individuals actually form their own gender identity and express it within this whole system.
All right, let's lay that groundwork then. A social construct. You said it's a shared meaning, an idea that only exists because we, as a society, collectively agree it does.
Yeah, we agree on it, we accept it, and crucially, we constantly reproduce it through just our everyday interactions. Think about something like a national border. It's just a line on a map, right?
Yeah.
Invisible from a plane.
But the second you try to cross it on the ground, suddenly everything changes: laws, language, customs. That line becomes incredibly real because we've all agreed it signifies a difference. Okay. And other examples the sources mentioned were things like laws themselves, the idea of countries, even what we call common sense. These things feel solid, but they change over time and between cultures.
Exactly. They're human creations.
Yeah.
So if gender is one of these constructs, how does it get so locked in, so seemingly universal in our society?
This is where we bring in that theory you mentioned, Judith Lorber's model. She argues gender works in three ways at the same time: as a process, a system of stratification, and a social institution. Okay, let's try and unpack that.
Let's start with gender as a process. This is basically socialization. It's how we learn the culture, the roles, the expectations tied to gender, mostly through interacting with others. We're sort of trained into it from day one.
Trained, often without even realizing it. And the sources point to four big players in this training, the main agents of socialization. Family, first and foremost, then schools, our peer groups, and of course, mass media.
And there are secondary ones too, like religion and the workplace that keep reinforcing it. But yeah, family is usually ground zero. It's where we first internalize what gender means.
How does that work in practice? The sources mention things like exposure, right?
Yeah.
Just seeing how things are done.
Definitely. Even if, say, both parents work, if the mother is consistently the one doing the emotional heavy lifting, organizing schedules, handling the invisible domestic work, children absorb that. They see a gender division of labor and start to think it's just normal.
The hidden curriculum of home life. And toys, that's a classic example. Dolls and play kitchens for girls, trucks and building blocks for boys. It's not just about play, is it?
Not at all. It's subtly steering them towards different skills, different values, even different emotional expressions. Nurturing versus toughness, care versus competition. It's setting up future pathways.
And the sources bring up this idea of differential privilege. Even parents who want to treat their kids equally often end up giving boys more autonomy.
Yeah, often more autonomy, more independence, maybe fewer restrictions on where they can go, what they can wear, who they date. Boys might get chores like taking out the trash or mowing the lawn, tasks seen as requiring toughness or independence.
While girls get assigned things like laundry, tidying up,
Mm.
tasks that signal neatness, domesticity, maybe being more careful or quiet.
Right. And those expectations for girls being passive, nurturing, focused on the home, they subtly limit their horizons, preparing them for potentially subordinate roles later on in a system that often values those masculine traits more.
And this whole process kicks off right at the start with gender assignment, just the act of saying it's a boy or it's a girl at birth. The sources mentioned old-fashioned birth announcements as an example of society formally labeling you.
And now we have the whole phenomenon of gender reveal parties, which
Mhm.
are, wow, talk about a public performance of assignment.
Yeah, it's not just announcing a biological fact. It's this big social declaration of gender identity before the kid even has a say. And that example the sources gave. A gender reveal party's fireworks starting a huge wildfire.
It's a pretty potent metaphor, isn't it? The explosive, sometimes destructive commitment society has to imposing and celebrating this binary, often regardless of the cost. Hashtag 1.2 gender as a system of stratification.
Okay, so we have this process of learning and being assigned gender. When that process becomes systematic, creating ranks,
Hmm.
that's where we get to Lorber's second point. Gender as a system of stratification.
Exactly. Think of social stratification like layers, like geological strata in rock. It's a system where society ranks categories of people in a hierarchy, usually on things like wealth, income, education, status.
And our socioeconomic status, or SES, is basically our position within those layers.
Right. And the sources are really clear. Gender is a major factor determining your SES pretty much everywhere. Stratification means those differences we learn through socialization aren't just differences, they're given unequal value, unequal power.
So in societies that are patriarchal, where men and masculinity are valued more highly, the gender process we just talked about doesn't just create boys and girls. It actively limits the possibilities for anyone socialized as feminine or anyone who falls outside that binary altogether.
It's structural. It's built into the system. It means that people born with male sex characteristics and socialized as masculine tend to automatically get advantages, politically, economically, legally. It's an imbalance of power based purely on that social agreement about gender, not on any inherent biological truth.
You can see that so clearly historically. Like in the U.S., women couldn't even vote until 1919. That alone cemented male political power for generations.
And the effects linger. The sources point out we still haven't had a woman president, and Congress is far from equal representation. That figure, 2.3 in the source material, really drives that home.
And that lack of representation isn't just symbolic. It has real policy impacts, right?
Absolutely. The sources cited that National Women's Law Center data showing that when women do achieve higher representation in state legislatures, they introduce and pass more laws specifically targeting gender inequality, things like better childcare support, stronger sexual harassment laws, paid leave, minimum wage increases.
So it's a direct feedback loop. The system holds certain groups back, and when those groups gain some power, they immediately try to change the system to make it fairer. It kind of proves the point that the structure itself, based on gender, shapes policy and quality of life.
Precisely. And this stratification isn't just politics. It runs through everything: education, income, even things like food security and health outcomes. The data consistently shows advantages for men over women, and especially over trans and non-binary people. Gender is a fundamental layer of inequality. Hashtag 1.3 gender as a social institution.
Okay, so process creates difference, stratification assigns unequal value. How does it all become so ingrained, so stable? That's the third piece. Gender as a social institution.
Yes. A social institution is basically a big, stable, predictable pattern of social relationships and practices. Think of things like the family, education, the economy, law. They create social order. And gender, Warburg argues, is one of these massive institutions. It's woven into almost everything.
Predictable.
Okay.
So gender helps organize society. Like, you know what to expect based on someone's perceived gender.
In a way, yes. It acts like a huge sorting mechanism. Think about how often you're asked your gender on forms, job applications, medical intake, even library cards like Figure 2.4 shows. Why?
Because it determines eligibility for services, jobs, maybe even which clubs you can join.
Exactly. It defines roles in the family, who's expected to be the primary caregiver, who manages money. It shapes marketing, who are certain products aimed at. It dictates fashion norms, recreational activities, even which public bathroom you're supposed to use. It's like the water we swim in, often invisible until it's challenged.
Okay, but institutions are supposed to be stable. What happens when they are challenged? We've seen, especially since the mid-20th century, more pushback against the binary, more acceptance of non-binary, gender-fluid identities. How does a stable institution cope with that?
Now that's where it gets really interesting, sociologically speaking. These changes, the growing visibility and acceptance of trans and non-binary experiences, they represent a kind of stress test, a breakdown and a reordering of that institutionalized gender structure. The institution is changing, but it's often slow and comes with a lot of friction.
Friction because it's tied to power.
Precisely. Remember stratification. Those who benefit most from the current patriarchal setup, where being perceived as male often comes with built-in advantages, tend to see these challenges to the binary as a threat.
A threat to their position, their guaranteed status within the system.
Exactly. If the rules of the institution change, their advantage might disappear. This is why understanding gender as a construct, something flexible and human-made, is so important. It reminds us the current system isn't inevitable.
It can be changed. It can adapt.
Right. And knowing that can actually reduce some of the anxiety people feel around changing norms. It suggests we can actually work towards redesigning the institution to be more equitable for everyone.
That idea of flexibility leads us perfectly into this next part, which tackles probably the biggest assumption, that biology itself demands just two genders. We're all sort of taught that sex and gender are the same thing, and that sex is just simple, binary biology, ovaries, or tests, XX or XY.
But the source material really pushes back hard on that. It argues that biological variation, just natural diversity, produces a spectrum that fundamentally challenges that neat binary. We need to be careful with our terms here. Sex assigned at birth, or SAB, that's the label given based on anatomy, hormones, chromosomes observed at birth.
And the mistake is thinking SAB must be one of only two options.
Exactly. That assumption ignores the actual biological reality, which is far more varied. Hashtag 2.1, the chemistry and spectrum of sex.
Okay, let's quickly recap the basic biology we learn in school. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? 22 autosome pairs, and one pair of sex chromosomes, usually XX or XY.
Usually, yes. And typically, XX leads to the development of ovaries, a vagina, uterus, and the body producing higher levels of estrogen and progesterone. XY typically signals tests, a penis, and higher levels of androgens, especially testosterone.
But here's the key thing the sources emphasize, which often gets glossed over. Everyone has all of those hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. It's the balance that differs.
Precisely. The ratio varies between typical males and females, and it fluctuates throughout our lives. These hormones influence way more than just reproduction. They affect mood, physical development, social behaviors.
And this biological fact directly supports the experiences of many trans and non-binary people, doesn't it? The sources mention hormone therapies.
Yes. Hormone replacement therapy, HRT, for trans individuals works by adjusting that natural hormonal balance. For a trans woman, taking estrogen and progesterone shifts the balance to encourage changes like breast development or softer skin. For a trans man, taking testosterone helps develop facial hair, a deeper voice, different muscle mass.
So it's not creating something artificial, it's shifting a naturally existing spectrum to align the body with the person's internal identity.
Exactly. And if we move from the hormones to the physical anatomy, again, the idea of just two options falls apart. We assume it's either, but the sources stress there's a whole spectrum of normal variations in infant genitalia. It's not as rare as people think, maybe 1 in 5,000 births, possibly more.
How do doctors even describe that variation? If it's not just male or female, is there a system?
There is. It's mentioned in the sources, the Quickly scale. developed back in 1995 by a pediatric endocrinologist. It's a medical tool, not just a theory. Yeah. It describes the range of possibilities for external genitalia, usually on a scale from 1 being typically masculinized up to 6 or 7 being typically feminized, with various stages in between representing different degrees of variation.
The very fact that a medical scale exists to chart a spectrum between the two poles proves that biology itself isn't strictly binary.
It absolutely demonstrates that lived biological reality is more complex than the simple social categories we impose on it. Hashtag tag tag 2.2, intersex and differences in sexual development, DSD.
So this range of variations falls under the medical term differences in sexual development, or DSD.
Yes, DSD is the umbrella term used now. It covers genetic, hormonal, or anatomical variations that result in sex characteristics like chromosomes, gonads, or genitals that don't fit neatly into those typical binary definitions. And people with DSD sometimes identify using the term intersex.
Can you give an example of how this challenges the binary at a really fundamental level, like chromosomes?
Sure. One well-known example is Klinefelter syndrome, where a person has XXY chromosomes instead of just XX or XY. Their chromosomes themselves are intersex. It directly refutes the idea that you must be chromosomally either male or female.
Okay. And beyond the core reproductive stuff, there are other physical traits too, right? It's actually dimorphic traits.
Right. These are characteristics that tend to differ between sexes but aren't directly involved in reproduction. Things like typical differences in height, muscle mass distribution, body hair patterns, voice pitch.
The sources mentioned the historical bearded lady phenomenon.
Yes, hirsutism, where women develop hair in patterns typically associated with men, was often put on display in circuses. It shows how society has historically been both fascinated and made anxious by these natural variations that blur the lines of the expected binary.
And if we look beyond humans, does the animal kingdom stick to the binary?
Not even close. The sources bring up gynandomorphism. This is seen in some birds, insects, spiders, where an individual animal is literally, visibly, half male and half female, often split right down the midline.
Wow. Like one side has male coloration, the other female.
Exactly. It's a stunning visual reminder that a strict biological binary isn't some universal law of nature. It's more like a human system of classification that doesn't always fit the data. Hashtag 2.3 medical interventions and harmful constructs.
This is where the story takes a darker turn, though, because society has tried to force reality into that binary box. The sources talk about non-consensual surgeries on infants born with DSD.
Yes. Historically, it was common practice. If an infant's genitals were considered ambiguous or didn't meet a certain size criteria, the sources mention a threshold of less than 2.5 centimeters for a phallus. For instance, surgeries were often performed very early on.
To normalize them.
Yeah.
To make them fit clearly into either the male or female category so they can be raised accordingly.
That was the justification, often framed as being in the best interest of the child to avoid social stigma. But the reality for many individuals who underwent these surgeries without consent is devastating.
Oh, so?
They described lifelong trauma, feelings of shame and secrecy because they were often never told the full truth. Physical complications like scarring, chronic pain, infections, loss of sensation, and profound psychological distress from having their bodies altered without their knowledge or consent.
And there's an even darker layer here mentioned in the sources: sterilization.
Yes. These surgeries, aimed at creating a normal appearance, often involved removing gonadal tissue or otherwise resulted in sterilization. This meant the individual might be unable to have biological children later in life.
And the sources explicitly connect this to historical eugenics projects. The idea of actively trying to eliminate intersex variations from the population.
That potential link is raised, yes. That the drive to surgically correct intersex bodies might have been influenced, consciously or not, by a broader societal desire, rooted in eugenics, to enforce a rigid two-sex model and eliminate perceived deviations. It's a very disturbing possibility.
It really shows the lengths society would go to uphold the binary, treating natural human variation as a defect, requiring surgical intervention.
Thankfully, the medical perspective has shifted significantly. Major organizations like the World Health Organization and the American Academy of Pediatrics now strongly advocate against these irreversible surgeries on infants, recommending they be deferred until the individual is old enough to understand and provide informed consent.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah.
And it contrasts so sharply with how some other cultures viewed these variations, right? The sources mentioned the Greek deity Hermaphroditus.
Right. Figure 2.10 shows depictions. In ancient Greece, Hermaphroditus, who embodied both male and female characteristics, wasn't seen as flawed, but as a symbol of unity, of wholeness. a completely different perspective than the Western medical correction model.
So this intense societal pressure to maintain the binary, even through surgery, leads to what the sources call three harmful social constructs about sex.
Yes, let's list them. First, the idea that sex can be determined by a single trait, like saying all women have breasts. It ignores the complex combination of chromosomes, hormones, internal and external anatomy. No single feature defines sex.
Okay, second.
Second, the construct that sex itself is inherently binary. As we've seen, biology shows a spectrum. Forcing a binary choice invalidates the reality of intersex lives and ignores the actual science of genetics and hormones.
And the third one feels incredibly relevant right now.
It is. The third harmful construct is the belief that genitals are reliable indicators of gender. This assumption underlies so much social sorting, but it's particularly dangerous now.
The sources cited those laws in Ohio and New Jersey, allowing school staff to potentially inspect students' genitals to determine sports eligibility.
Yes. It's presented as a way to enforce fairness in gendered sports, but the sources condemn it as deeply invasive, a violation of bodily autonomy, potentially traumatic, and possibly even constituting sexual assault, all based on the scientifically flawed premise that genitals equal gender and that the binary is absolute.
Okay, so we've really dismantled the idea that gender is purely biological or that sex itself is strictly binary. Now we need to shift focus from the external structures in biology to the internal experience. How do we actually develop our sense of gender identity?
Exactly. We're moving now to identity formation. This is the lifelong process where we figure out who we are, how we're different from others, and how we fit into the social world around us, from the big systems down to the individual self.
A good place to start, maybe, is with that classic sociological idea, Cooley's looking-glass self. The idea that our sense of self isn't just internal, it's reflected back at us by society.
Precisely. Cooley argued our self-concept comes in 3 steps. We imagine how we appear to other people. Then, we imagine how they're judging that appearance. And finally, we develop a self-feeling, like pride or shame or mortification based on that imagined judgment.
So it's like a constant feedback loop. If I try expressing my gender in a way that goes against the norm, I imagine people reacting negatively, I feel anxious or ashamed, and that shapes how I see myself and maybe what I dare to express next time.
Exactly. That anticipated judgment, whether it's real or imagined, heavily influences our internal sense of self and our outward behavior. Hashtag tag tag 3.1 Sociological Theories of Self-Development, Mead.
George Herbert Mead took this idea even further, didn't he? He had a more detailed model for how the self develops through social interaction, through learning to see ourselves as others see us.
Yes, Mead's work is foundational here. He talked about the self having 2 parts, the I and the me. The me is the socialized self. It's the part of you that has internalized society's attitudes, the expectations of others. Think of it as your public face, the self you present based on how you think others see you.
Kind of like your internal censor or your public persona.
Sort of, yeah. And the I is the more spontaneous, impulsive, creative part of the self. It's the part that responds to the me, the part that acts, that initiates. The I might have an impulse, but the me considers the social consequences before acting. Our sense of self emerges from the ongoing dialogue between the I and the me.
Okay, and Mead saw this developing in stages, right? How does that apply to learning gender?
It applies directly. He outlined roughly 4 stages. First, the preparatory stage. Infants and young children just imitate others without understanding the meaning. A toddler might mimic putting on makeup or shaving, just copying actions.
Okay, simple imitation.
Second, the play stage. This is crucial. Children start taking on roles, pretending to be specific people, mommy, daddy, doctor, firefighter. They're practicing different identities, trying them on for size. This is where they start associating certain behaviors and objects with certain roles, often gendered ones.
Like playing house or cops and robbers.
Exactly. Then comes the game stage. This is more complex. Instead of just one role, children learn to understand multiple roles simultaneously and the rules governing their interactions, like in a team sport. You need to understand your position, the pitcher's role, the batter's role, the rules of baseball itself.
So in terms of gender, this is where you learn not just how to be a boy-girl, but the whole system of expectations. How boys are expected to interact with girls, what's considered appropriate or inappropriate within the larger social game.
Precisely. You learn the social rules attached to gender identities. And finally, there's internalization. This is where those societal norms, the rules of the game, the expectations learned through play and games, become deeply embedded. They become part of your own sense of self, often unconsciously. You don't just follow the rules become who you feel you are.
So gender identity isn't just assigned at birth. It's this long, complex process of learning, practicing, and internalizing social meaning.
Exactly. It's a mix of that socialization, our own individual interpretation, and as we discussed, the underlying biological factors too. It's a lifelong journey. Hashtag tag 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 3.2 gender identity and navigating distress.
Which brings us squarely to gender identity. The sources define this as the internal personal sense of being male, female, both, neither, or somewhere else along the gender spectrum. It's how you experience yourself.
And importantly, this internal sense can form very early. The sources note that research shows even very young children, like 3 or 4 years old, can have a consistent sense of their gender identity that might differ from the one they were assigned at birth. They start to self-socialize based on that internal feeling.
We need the right language here. Transgender, or trans, is the term for someone whose gender identity doesn't align with the sex they were assigned at birth. And again, that 1.6 million figure in the U.S. alone shows this isn't marginal.
Right. And we also need to acknowledge identities beyond the binary. Non-binary or genderqueer are terms people use when their identity isn't exclusively man or woman. They might feel like a mix of both, neither, or something else entirely.
And many non-binary people prefer gender-neutral pronouns, like they, them, or sometimes others like see here. Using the right pronouns is basic respect.
Absolutely crucial. Now, when there's that mismatch between assigned sex and internal identity, it can cause significant distress. This is known as gender dysphoria.
It's important to stress what the sources say here. Gender dysphoria is about the distress caused by that incongruence, often amplified by societal non-acceptance. The identity itself, being trans or non-binary, is not a mental disorder.
Precisely. The distress often comes from the body not matching the internal sense, or from society constantly invalidating who you are. This is why transitioning, which can involve social changes like name and pronouns, medical steps like hormones or surgery, or legal changes can be so incredibly important. It often resolves the dysphoria by aligning the external reality with the internal truth.
But navigating a world that insists on the binary can impose its own trauma, even without dysphoria being the main issue. Terms like misgendering.
Which is referring to someone using pronouns or gendered language that doesn't match their identity.
Dead naming.
Continuing to call a trans person by the name they were assigned at birth, which they no longer use.
These aren't just accidental slip-ups, are they? The sources frame them as actively harmful.
They are deeply harmful. They repeatedly deny the person's reality, invalidate their identity, and can be incredibly painful and distressing. It essentially tells them, I don't see you as you are. I only see you as who I think you should be, based on your assignment at birth.
It creates an environment of constant erasure, of feeling unsafe or unwelcome.
Which is why the simple act of asking for and consistently using someone's correct name and pronouns is so powerful. It's a fundamental way to show respect, create inclusive spaces, and affirm that person's identity. Figure 2.13 in the sources really highlights this point about fostering welcoming settings. Hashtag tag 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 3.3 gender expression and policing.
Okay, so we have internal identity. How we show that to the world is gender expression, right? Clothing, hairstyle, mannerisms, how we carry ourselves.
Exactly. It's the outward presentation. And ideally, expression aligns with identity, but is also shaped by social context, safety, personal choice. It can be fluid.
But society has pretty rigid ideas about what expression should match which assigned sex, and that leads to gender policing.
Yes, this is the enforcement part. It's when people impose or enforce those normative gender expressions. Think about the reactions someone might get if they step outside the expected lines. A boy wearing a dress, a woman being too loud or too assertive, someone not performing femininity or masculinity correctly.
It can range from subtle disapproval or jokes all the way to open hostility, bullying, or even violence. Policing aims to keep people in their assigned boxes. Hashtag tag tag 3.4 masculinities and femininities.
And those boxes are defined by culturally specific ideals of masculinity and femininity. Sociologist Raewyn Connell gave us the concept of hegemonic masculinity.
Hegemonic, meaning dominant, the top dog version.
Essentially, yes. It's the culturally idealized form of masculinity in a given society, the one that's held up as superior to other forms of masculinity, like gay masculinity, and to femininity. It typically emphasizes things like independence, aggression, competition, toughness, emotional restraint. Figure 2.14 touches on this.
And then there's toxic masculinity. How's that different?
Toxic masculinity is often seen as an extreme, harmful consequence of the pressure to conform to hegemonic masculinity. It involves rigidly suppressing emotions other than anger, valuing violence, dominance over women, risky behaviors, and aggressively rejecting anything perceived as feminine.
And that pressure is intense. The sources mention Emily Kane's research, finding parents were way more worried about their sons showing any feminine traits, like liking pink or being gentle, than they were about daughters acting like tomboys.
Yes, the policing against boys crossing into feminine territory is often much harsher, reflecting a societal devaluation of femininity and intense pressure on boys to adhere to that tough, dominant ideal.
But wait. If those hegemonic traits, aggression, competitiveness, maybe even a bit of ruthlessness, are what often lead to success in things like business or politics within our current system, isn't that kind of masculinity, even if toxic, actually functional for maintaining the status quo?
That's the deep, uncomfortable paradox, isn't it? Yes, in many ways, those traits are functional for succeeding within existing patriarchal and capitalist power structures that reward dominance and accumulation. But, and this is a huge but, it's often incredibly dysfunctional for the individual man's well-being.
How so?
Because adhering to that rigid code often means sacrificing emotional expression, vulnerability, deep connection, physical health through risk-taking, and mental health. It can lead to isolation, violence, and shorter lifespans. So, functional for the system, potentially destructive for the person.
Okay. What about the other side? What's the dominant ideal for femininity?
The counterpart is often called emphasized femininity. This involves expressions that align with women's perceived subordination, accommodating men's interests, focusing on being nurturing, attractive, physically small or non-threatening, emotionally available. This ideal gets rewarded in patriarchal cultures because it doesn't challenge male dominance.
But that ideal isn't neutral either. Patricia Hill Collins brings in the intersectional critique here, right?
Absolutely crucial. Collins points out that this ideal femininity is usually based on the experiences and appearance of privileged, wealthy, white women. It often marginalizes women of color, working class women, older women, disabled women, through racist or classist stereotypes, unattainable beauty standards focused on youth, lightness, thinness.
And this pressure to conform leads to something called the feminine apologetic. What's that?
It's this sort of balancing act women are often expected to perform. If they participate in activities traditionally seen as masculine, maybe playing a contact sport, being a CEO, working in construction, they often feel pressure to simultaneously emphasize conventional feminine traits in their appearance or demeanor.
Like they have to apologize for stepping into masculine territory by being extra feminine elsewhere.
Kind of, yeah. It's to reassure society they aren't really challenging the gender order too much. Think about the marketing of tools specifically in pink for women, like in Figure 2.1 Civ, or female athletes feeling the need to wear makeup or emphasize their heterosexuality while competing fiercely.
It's about mitigating the threat they might pose to the traditional hierarchy by performing femininity alongside competence.
Exactly. And it circles back to that valuation issue. The sources note that girls acting like tomboys is often tolerated, even sometimes encouraged because masculinity is valued, but boys acting like sissies, almost always strongly discouraged because femininity is devalued. Even trans people often face pressure to conform perfectly to the binary expectations of their identified gender, what's called passing, Figure 2.8, showing how strong that institutional binary still is. Hashtag tag 3.5. Moving beyond the binary.
So when you look at it all together, hegemonic masculinity, emphasized femininity, the policing, the binary structure seems strategically designed to maintain hierarchy.
That's a key insight from the sources. Binary thinking is a powerful tool for stratification. You define two opposing poles, associate the dominant group, men masculine, with the traits society values more, strength, rationality, independence, and associate the subordinate group, women feminine binary, with the less valued traits, emotion, dependence, nurturing. The poles define each other in opposition.
So breaking down that binary, acknowledging the spectrum, the complexity, non-binary identities, gender fluidity, it's not just about individual identity, it actually challenges the entire system of stratification.
Precisely. Recognizing the full range of human gender experience makes room for a much fairer, more equitable society where people aren't forced into boxes that limit their potential or deny their reality. It benefits everyone by loosening those rigid constraints. Hashtag tag outro.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've really dug into the sources you provided. looking at gender as this huge social institution, this system of ranking people.
Yeah, and then we shifted to biology, showing how even biological sex isn't the simple binary we assume it is. The variations are natural.
Right. And finally, we looked at how individuals navigate all this, how we form our own internal sense of identity and how we express it, often under intense social pressure.
It's been a real deep dive. And if there's one core message to take away, it's that central idea. Gender and the sex binary it's built on are fundamentally social constructs. They are incredibly real in their consequences, shaping our lives profoundly, but they are not objectively universally true.
Real but not true. I think I've got it now.
And understanding that these are human-made systems hopefully reduces some of the fear around change. If we built these structures, we can also adapt them, make them more inclusive, less rigid.
Absolutely. Now, as we wrap up, I want to loop back to something really unsettling we touched on earlier concerning how far society has gone to enforce that rigidity.
The surgeries on intersex infants.
Exactly. We talked about how those non-consensual surgeries were historically performed, often justified as being for the child's own good to make them fit the binary. But we also noted the consequence, frequent sterilization, and the potential link the sources raised to historical eugenics projects aimed at actually eliminating intersex variations from the population.
It's a profoundly disturbing history.
It is. So here's the final thought, the provocative question I want to leave you, our listener, with. Drawing directly from that dark history explored in our sources, if we know that throughout recent history, powerful forces within society actively, sometimes violently, enforced a strict male-female binary through irreversible medical interventions, potentially driven by a desire to eliminate those who didn't fit, how does that knowledge, that history of attempted erasure, inform the way we should view the intense political and social debates happening right now around the identities, rights, and expressions of transgender and non-binary people today?
That's certainly something to mull over. How the past echoes in the present, and how the impulse to enforce rigid categories persists.
Definitely something to think about as you reflect on how these structures shape your own life and the world around you. Thank you again for sharing these fascinating and challenging sources with us and joining us for this deep dive.
We hope this exploration has been valuable.